Now on the President's remarks today on Syria, we're joined by Congressman Peter Welch, who's just returned from his 6th trip to the region. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
You visited, I believe, a refugee camp in Turkey near the border with Syria. We've been seeing images of 1 million or so civilians leaving Syria, bomb explosions within the country. But what did you actually see, or what can you tell us?
Well, it's on the Kilis refugee camp is on the Turkish-Syrian border. There are about 13,000 people there. Turkey's been very generous, and it's probably one of the best refugee camps. But the fact is, it's heartbreaking when you're seeing families where their husbands or their sons or their brothers are left behind in Syria, or they're dead. We saw kids who had wicked burn injuries from having been the indirect victims of the firing by the Assad regime. And you just are listening to folks who are imploring us to find some way to get them back to their country. So it's a very heartbreaking scene. This is 13,000 people, and there's literally millions of Syrians who are refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, or internally displaced within Syria. So it's a very grim humanitarian scene.
So, Congressman, in light of what you've seen, do you think this discussion about a red line has actually allowed Assad to do things to over 70,000, of course 70,000 dead, many thousands injured, that in a sense the humanitarian need in Syria demanded action sooner?
Well, you know, the humanitarian need is great. And every impulse that any of us have is to try to respond and stop the slaughter. The dilemma is, it's very difficult on a practical level to figure out what you can do that in fact will make the situation better as opposed to worse. You know, we can't have troops on the ground there. In Syria, there are tribal rivalries that go back decades. There's a certain unity and opposition to bring down Assad. But you've got Sunni, Shia, Druze, Christians, Alawite, Kurds. And many of those are fighting to bring Assad down, but once Assad goes, they're going to turn the guns on each other and settle scores. So the idea of arming rebels is very difficult to figure out who are the so-called good rebels, and there are enormous problems with the implementation of a no-fly zone, which would require very extensive bombing by the U.S. to bring out the anti-aircraft defenses, and would in all likelihood result in civilian casualties and run the risk of Americanizing what is a very bitter civil war.
So the President made it clear today that he's not going to be rushed into Syria in the way, of course, that President Bush was and Dick Cheney rushed into Iraq. Do you support the President's stance?
Well, I do, because
notwithstanding the suffering you've seen.
Yeah, here's why I do. It's not as though the need to do something creates the ability to do something that's effective. You know, the red line we should have is what's in our national security interest. And there's a lot of armchair generals here who are suggesting that we can go in there and take some definitive military action. And it often is the same people who gave us the good news that we'd have no problem in Iraq, and the nation-building enterprise in Afghanistan would work out fine. So, in fact, the President's caution makes sense here. I mean, anything we can do to provide humanitarian assistance, we clearly should do. Any negotiations we can be engaged in, we should be involved in. But the actual step into a no-fly zone or even arming the rebels is fraught with a lot of complications that when we wake up the morning after, I think have to be seriously considered.
Right. Now, you know that Secretary of State John Kerry is in Moscow today. He's trying to get the Russians to play a constructive role within the Syrian crisis. There's proposal for some talks very soon involving the Russians and Europeans. Is it too late, though?
No. Look, we don't know. I mean, this is a horrendous civil war in Syria, and you've got that country is riven with tribal and ethnic rivalries that Assad has put the lid on basically through oppression. Once that lid comes off, it's not as though there's a peace and tranquility among those groups that'll be at each other's throats. But anything that we can do diplomatically, humanitarian, we should be doing. And in fact, if you had the Russians playing a constructive role. That obviously would help enormously because in the end, the Syrians are going to have to resolve this, and if this is part of a big power chess game, it's just going to make that stability outcome much more difficult.
Congressman Peter Welch, I know you've rushed to the camera.